Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome back to this cozy corner of history where we explore the stories that time tried to bury. Tonight, we're diving into one of medieval society's darkest chapters, not the romanticized tales of knights and castles, but the brutal reality of what happened when a single white spot on your skin could destroy everything you'd ever known. We're exploring the true experience of medieval lepers, people who were declared legally dead while still breathing, forced to announce their presence with wooden clappers so others could flee in terror. This isn't a story about disease. It's about what happens when fear and ignorance combine to create a living hell for innocent people. You'll discover why a respected carpenter could lose his family, his home, and his very identity overnight, condemned to watch his children grow up from behind the boundaries of exile. We'll explore the medieval ceremony that literally buried people alive in society's eyes and witness how communities systematically erased human beings who were guilty of nothing more than developing symptoms they couldn't control. Whether you're nestled under warm blankets ready to drift off to sleep, or simply seeking to unwind with some gentle historical storytelling, I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this evening with me. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a comfort to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from every corner of the globe. And if you find peace in these calm, immersive tales from ages past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey together. But for now, let's allow the gentle weight of modern comfort to settle around you as we travel back to a time and place where the simple touch of human skin against skin was a luxury beyond imagination for the afflicted. Tonight, we're standing on the muddy path outside the village of Ashworth in Yorkshire, England, following a story that will remind us just how precious our freedom to move through the world unmarked and unannounced truly is. Picture yourself settling deeper into your pillow as we begin this tale of Thomas the carpenter, a man who was once beloved by his community until the day 3 small white spots appeared on his forearm. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow as we explore together what it meant to become invisible while still drawing breath. Take a deep breath with me now, feeling the softness of your bedding, the warmth of your room, the safety of your walls. Hold on to that comfort as we journey back to the year 1298, to a world where such simple pleasures were luxuries beyond imagination for those unfortunate enough to find themselves marked by God's most mysterious curse. The morning mist still clung to the Yorkshire hills when Thomas first heard the sound that would follow him for the rest of his days. The hollow, rhythmic clacking of wood against wood, growing louder as it approached the village gates. Imagine the dampness of dawn settling on your skin as you stand beside him in those final moments before understanding changed everything. The sound echoed off the stone walls of Ashworth's modest houses, a percussion that announced the approach of the unclean, the outcasts, the living dead who walked among the healthy, but could never again be part of their world. Thomas had heard that sound before, of course. Every villager knew the wooden clapper that lepers were required by law to carry, warning others of their presence so the healthy could flee to safety. He had crossed himself and muttered prayers when that distinctive sound drifted through the village streets, grateful that God's terrible affliction had passed over his own family. He had watched from his workshop window as the cloaked figures shuffled past, faces hidden in shadow, hands wrapped in strips of cloth, their bodies slowly being consumed by the disease that medieval people believed was both punishment for sin and test of faith. Now, as the sound grew closer on this particular morning, Thomas felt the first stirrings of a fear he couldn't yet name. The 3 white patches on his arm, each no larger than a copper coin, had appeared over the past month. He had told himself they were nothing, perhaps a reaction to some new wood he'd been working with, or simple blemishes that would fade with time. His wife Margaret had applied poultices of herbs and mutton fat, whispering prayers as she worked. But the spots had neither darkened nor disappeared. If anything, they seemed to be growing slightly larger, their edges more defined against his weathered skin. Feel your heart racing as you imagine Thomas's panic in that moment, when the cloaked figures stopped directly outside his workshop. Through the gaps in his wooden shutters, he could see 3 figures wrapped in grey robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. One carried the wooden clapper, letting it fall silent as they paused at his door. Another held a begging bowl, while the third leaned heavily on a walking stick, one foot wrapped in blood-stained cloth where toes had once been. They stood there in the morning silence, and Thomas felt his world beginning to crack apart like poorly joined wood under too much weight. "Thomas Milwright," came a voice from beneath one of the hoods, hollow and distant, as if spoken through cloth. "We know you are within. We have heard troubling rumors about your condition and have come at the direction of Father Benedict." His wife Margaret stood frozen beside their small hearth, her face already telling him she understood what this visit meant. Their 2 children, young Mary and baby William, played innocently with wooden toys their father had carved, unaware that their family was about to be destroyed by forces they couldn't comprehend. The normal sounds of village life, hammering from the blacksmith's forge, the baker calling his wares, children playing in the streets, continued outside, but already they seemed to belong to a world from which Thomas was being expelled. In medieval England, the process of determining whether someone had leprosy was both primitive and devastating. The church had established specific procedures for examining suspected cases, understanding that a diagnosis meant complete social death, even while the person remained physically alive. Father Benedict would have received reports about Thomas's condition from concerned parishioners. Perhaps someone had noticed him scratching at his arm during Mass, or seen him examining the white patches when he thought no one was looking. In a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business, such changes didn't go unnoticed for long. The examination itself was a public humiliation designed as much to protect the community as to determine the truth. Thomas was brought before a panel consisting of the priest, the village reeve, and several respected elders, along with any lepers who lived in the area and could provide their expertise in recognizing the disease's signs. This wasn't a private medical consultation, but a community event where a man's entire future would be decided based on limited knowledge and superstitious belief. Consider what Thomas faced as he was ordered to remove his clothing and submit to examination by people who understood leprosy primarily through religious doctrine rather than medical science. They looked for white or reddish patches on the skin, areas of numbness where sensation had been lost, thickening of facial features, changes in voice quality, and the distinctive claw-like deformity of hands as the disease progressed. They pricked his skin with pins to test for numbness, examined his hair and eyebrows for thinning, and looked for telltale signs of infection in his extremities. What they didn't understand was that leprosy is actually one of the least contagious diseases known to medicine. Approximately 95% of people have natural immunity to it, and even those who don't require prolonged close contact with an infected person to contract the disease. The medieval fear of contagion through casual contact was largely unfounded, but this knowledge lay centuries in the future. In Thomas's time, the disease was believed to spread through the air, through shared food or drink, even through the glance of an afflicted person. The examination revealed what Thomas had been dreading. The white patches on his arm showed no sensation when pricked with pins. His voice, they claimed, had grown slightly hoarser in recent weeks, though this might have been from the terror of his situation. Most damning of all, one of the examining lepers claimed to recognize the early signs from his own bitter experience. The verdict was unanimous and irreversible. Thomas of Ashworth was afflicted with leprosy and must immediately be separated from the community of the healthy. What followed was a ceremony that still chills the blood nearly 8 centuries later. The separatio leprosarium, the ritual separation of the leper from human society. Picture yourself in your bed surrounded by the love and acceptance of those who care for you. Then imagine watching your entire identity and social existence being methodically destroyed through religious ritual designed to emphasize your complete exclusion from the world of the living. Thomas was brought to the village church, where Father Benedict had prepared a special mass, the Missa pro leprosis, the Mass for lepers. This wasn't a celebration but a funeral, for Thomas was about to undergo a form of social death from which there could be no return. He was made to kneel in a specially prepared grave dug in the churchyard, symbolizing his death to the world. Earth was cast upon his head while the priest intoned the words, "Be thou dead to the world, but alive unto God." The ceremony continued with a litany of prohibitions that would govern the rest of Thomas's existence. He could never again enter a church, tavern, mill, or market. He could not walk on narrow paths where he might accidentally brush against a healthy person. He could not wash his hands or any of his belongings in streams or springs used by others. He could not touch anything in public markets without purchasing it. He could never go barefoot or leave his dwelling without his distinctive leper's costume and warning devices. Feel the soft fabric of your night clothes against your skin. Then imagine Thomas being dressed in the garments that would mark him as unclean for the remainder of his life. The grey robe that covered him from head to foot, designed to conceal his body and remind others of his polluted state. The wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow, sparing others the sight of his degradation. The gloves that covered his hands, which were considered particularly dangerous sources of contagion. And most symbolic of all, the wooden clapper that he would carry everywhere, announcing his presence so others could flee. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Thomas had awakened that morning as a respected craftsman, a husband and father, a valued member of his community. By evening, he had become a living ghost, legally dead but physically present, forced to witness the continuation of a life from which he was now permanently excluded. His wife Margaret was forbidden from living with him, or even touching him, though she was permitted to bring food and leave it at a specified distance from his new dwelling. His children would grow up knowing their father only as a shambling figure in grey robes who watched them from afar, but could never again hold them in his arms. The cottage where Thomas had lived and worked was sealed and abandoned, considered too contaminated for habitation by healthy people. His tools, his carefully crafted furniture, his personal possessions, all were either burned or left to rot, as nothing touched by a leper could be safely used by others. The life he had built over 35 years was erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. But exile from society was only the beginning of Thomas's suffering. He now faced the practical challenge of survival in a world that had systematically removed every means of supporting himself. Lepers were forbidden from practicing their trades, owning property, or engaging in most forms of commerce. They existed entirely on charity, the uncertain kindness of people who believed that giving alms to lepers was spiritually beneficial, but who often resented the burden and feared contamination. Thomas's new home was a small hut built outside the village boundaries, close enough that food could be brought to him, but far enough to minimize contact with the healthy. These leper huts, found on the outskirts of medieval communities throughout Europe, were primitive structures offering minimal protection from the elements. Built of rough wood or stone with thatched roofs that leaked, they provided shelter that was often worse than what was offered to animals. There was no furniture beyond what Thomas could construct with his own hands, no comfort beyond what could be provided by charity, no warmth beyond what could be generated by a small fire of gathered sticks. Appreciate the controlled temperature of your room, the clean linens of your bed, the security of walls and locks that protect you from intrusion. Then consider Thomas huddled in his drafty hut through the long Yorkshire winters. Medieval England was experiencing what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of particularly harsh winters that could last for months. Snow might block the path to his hut for weeks at a time, leaving him completely isolated and dependent on whatever food he had managed to store. Ice formed inside his dwelling on the coldest nights, and the small fire that provided his only warmth also filled the cramped space with smoke that burned his eyes and lungs. The disease itself continued its slow progression through Thomas's body. Modern understanding reveals leprosy as a chronic infection that primarily affects the skin, peripheral nerves, and mucous membranes. Left untreated, and medieval medicine had no effective treatments, it gradually destroys nerve endings, leading to loss of sensation in hands and feet. This numbness made lepers prone to injuries they couldn't feel, which then became infected and often led to the loss of fingers and toes that people associated with the disease itself. Thomas would have watched his body slowly changing in ways that medieval people found horrifying and repulsive. His skin might develop nodules and lesions, his facial features could become thickened and distorted, his voice might grow hoarse as the disease affected his throat and airways. These physical changes, combined with the poor nutrition and harsh living conditions imposed by his exile, would have aged him rapidly. Within a few years, he might have been unrecognizable as the robust craftsman who had once been a pillar of his community. The psychological torment was perhaps worse than the physical suffering. Thomas could see his village from his hut, could watch the daily life that continued without him. He might glimpse his wife Margaret walking to market or tending their small garden, now maintained by the charity of neighbors who pitied her plight. He could see his children playing in the streets, growing larger and more independent each day, but he could never approach them or call out to them. The sound of his wooden clapper would send them running in fear, just as he had once run from other lepers in the years before his diagnosis. Medieval lepers developed their own social structures and support networks, recognizing that survival depended on cooperation among the outcasts. Thomas would have gradually made contact with other lepers in the region, learning the skills necessary for survival on the margins of society. These informal communities shared information about which roads were safe to travel, which villages might provide charity, and which areas offered opportunities for the kind of work lepers were permitted to perform. Begging, though degrading, was one of the few ways lepers could obtain resources for survival, but even this was regulated by law and custom. Lepers had to remain at specified distances from healthy people, could not enter buildings or touch money directly, and had to identify themselves clearly as afflicted so others could take protective measures. Thomas would have learned to position himself along roads frequently traveled by pilgrims, merchants, and clergy, groups that medieval theology encouraged to give alms to lepers as a form of spiritual preparation. The begging itself was a complex ritual of humiliation and supplication. Thomas would have knelt by the roadside, his wooden clapper announcing his presence, his gloved hands extended to receive whatever charity might be offered. He could not speak directly to potential benefactors, but had to call out his request from a distance, his hoarse voice competing with wind and weather to be heard. Coins could not be placed in his hands, but had to be thrown to him or left on a cloth that he could then gather up. Food scraps were tossed to him as they might be to a dog, and he was expected to express gratitude for whatever he received, no matter how meager or degraded. Think about the dignity and respect with which you move through your daily life. Then imagine the constant humiliation that defined every interaction Thomas had with the healthy world. Children threw stones at him and called him names, considering it sport to torment someone who could not retaliate. Adults crossed themselves and muttered prayers when they saw him. treating his very existence as a reminder of divine judgment and human frailty. Even acts of charity were performed with obvious reluctance and fear, benefactors anxious to complete their good deed and escape potential contamination. The isolation was perhaps most acute during religious observances, which formed the center of medieval community life. Thomas had been a devout man who found comfort and meaning in the rhythms of the church calendar, the weekly celebration of Mass, and the communal celebration of holy days. Now he was forbidden from entering any church or participating in religious ceremonies, cut off from the spiritual community that had sustained him throughout his life. Medieval theology offered lepers a complex consolation for their suffering, teaching that their affliction was both punishment for sin and opportunity for spiritual purification. Lepers were encouraged to view their disease as a form of purgatory experienced in this life, their suffering serving to cleanse their souls and guarantee their salvation in the afterlife. Some religious texts even suggested that lepers were blessed among people, their visible affliction marking them as chosen by God for special spiritual treatment. This theological framework provided some comfort to Thomas and others like him, but it was cold consolation for the very real suffering they endured daily. The promise of heavenly reward did little to ease the pain of watching his children grow up from a distance, or the humiliation of begging for scraps from people who had once been his equals, or the physical agony of a disease slowly consuming his body without effective treatment or even understanding. Medieval medicine offered lepers various treatments based on the limited understanding of the time. Physicians believed leprosy was caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, particularly an excess of melancholic or corrupted blood. Treatments focused on purging these supposed impurities through bloodletting, purgatives, and dietary restrictions. Lepers might be advised to avoid certain foods thought to worsen their condition, particularly wine, spicy foods, and fresh fruits, while consuming others believed to have purifying properties. Herbal remedies were commonly prescribed, with ingredients ranging from the mildly beneficial to the actively harmful. Preparations containing mercury, arsenic, or other toxic substances were thought to cleanse the body of corruption, but often caused additional suffering and sometimes death. Religious medicine was equally important, with lepers encouraged to pray constantly, make pilgrimages to holy sites, and seek the intercession of saints known for healing powers. The most famous destination for lepers seeking miraculous cure was the shrine of Saint Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. Medieval legends claimed that touching relics associated with Saint Lazarus could cure the disease, leading desperate lepers to undertake arduous journeys across Europe in hope of healing. These pilgrimages were dangerous undertakings for healthy people and potentially fatal for those already weakened by disease and malnutrition. Thomas might have dreamed of making such a pilgrimage, but the practical obstacles were almost insurmountable. Lepers were forbidden from staying in inns or accepting hospitality from strangers, making long-distance travel extremely difficult. They had to sleep outdoors regardless of weather, carry their own food supplies, and navigate through communities that might drive them away with violence if they approached too closely. Many lepers died during such journeys, their bodies left unburied beside roads far from their homes. For those lepers who survived long enough, medieval society did provide one institutional alternative to complete social exile: the leper hospital or leprosarium. These religious institutions, funded by church donations and noble patronage, offered basic shelter and care for lepers who could gain admission. However, admission was competitive and often required connections or payment that poor lepers couldn't provide. The daily routine of Thomas's life as a leper would have been shaped by the basic necessities of survival under extremely difficult circumstances. He would wake before dawn in his cold, damp hut, his body stiff from sleeping on a bed of straw. The first task was always tending to his fire, if he had been able to maintain one through the night, or starting a new one from carefully hoarded embers. Fuel was a constant concern, as lepers were often forbidden from gathering wood in areas used by healthy people and had to scavenge for fallen branches or dried grass. Food preparation was another daily challenge. Thomas's meals would have been monotonous and nutritionally inadequate, consisting mainly of bread scraps, thin porridge made from whatever grain he could obtain, and occasional vegetables that were beginning to spoil. The leftovers healthy people couldn't use. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps obtained when a charitable person provided scraps from their table, or when Thomas was able to catch small animals in simple traps. The cooking facilities in his hut were primitive, typically just an open fire that filled the dwelling with smoke. Water was yet another problem. Lepers were forbidden from using wells, streams, or other water sources used by healthy people, forcing them to collect rainwater or find isolated springs that were considered safe for their use. During drought periods, obtaining clean water became a life-threatening challenge, and lepers sometimes died of thirst rather than risk contaminating sources needed by healthy communities. Personal hygiene, always challenging in medieval times, became almost impossible for lepers. They couldn't use public baths or wash in streams used by others, and obtaining soap or other cleaning materials required charity or trade. The distinctive odor associated with lepers in medieval accounts was probably due as much to their inability to maintain cleanliness as to their disease itself. This created a vicious cycle where their smell reinforced social disgust and made others even less likely to approach or help them. Clothing presented similar challenges. Lepers couldn't shop for garments in markets or employ tailors to make new clothes. They depended on cast-off garments provided by charity, often ill-fitting and worn beyond what healthy people would consider acceptable. Repairing clothes required skills and materials that were difficult to obtain, so lepers often wore patched and tattered garments that reinforced their appearance as social outcasts. Despite these hardships, Thomas and others like him found ways to maintain their humanity and even experience moments of joy or satisfaction. The community of lepers, though scattered and informal, provided emotional support and practical assistance that helped individuals survive. Lepers developed their own informal networks of communication, sharing information about sources of charity, safe routes of travel, and news from the broader world they had been forced to leave behind. Some lepers discovered unexpected talents or found meaning in activities they could pursue despite their restrictions. Thomas might have continued his woodworking on a small scale, carving simple items that could be sold or traded for necessities. Others became skilled at healing herbs or folk medicine, their knowledge of suffering making them surprisingly effective healers for problems that didn't require direct physical contact. A few became renowned storytellers or musicians, their entertainment valued even by people who feared their touch. The progression of leprosy itself varied greatly among individuals. Some experienced rapid deterioration, losing fingers and toes, developing severe facial deformities, and dying within a few years of diagnosis. Others lived for decades with relatively mild symptoms, their main suffering coming from social exile rather than physical degradation. Medieval people didn't understand these variations, leading to confusion about the disease's nature and prognosis. Thomas's particular case might have followed any of several patterns. If he was among the fortunate minority whose disease progressed slowly, he could have lived for many years as a leper, watching his children grow to adulthood from his exile, seeing grandchildren he could never hold, and observing the changes in his village across decades of separation. The emotional pain of this extended exile might have been worse than quick physical deterioration, as he remained mentally alert and emotionally connected to a world that had rejected him. Alternatively, his disease might have progressed rapidly, causing obvious physical changes that made him increasingly frightening to healthy observers. His hands might have become clawed as tendons contracted. His face might have developed the leonine features associated with advanced leprosy, and his voice might have become so distorted that communication became difficult. These changes would have made begging more challenging as people became less willing to approach close enough to give charity to someone whose appearance had become genuinely disturbing. The winter months were particularly brutal for lepers living in isolation. Thomas's small hut would have provided minimal protection against Yorkshire's harsh winters, with snow often blocking the path to his dwelling and cutting him off from even the limited contact he normally had with the healthy world. Fuel for heating was difficult to obtain and expensive when available, forcing lepers to choose between warmth and food when resources were limited. During these winter months, many lepers died not from their disease, but from cold, starvation, or diseases related to their weakened condition and poor living circumstances. Their deaths often went unnoticed for days or weeks, their bodies discovered only when spring melting revealed the evidence of their suffering. Medieval records show that leper communities had higher mortality rates during winter months, a pattern that reflected the additional hardships imposed by weather and isolation. Spring brought renewal, but also renewed suffering, as lepers emerged from their winter confinement to discover how much their condition had deteriorated during the months of privation. Thomas might have found that frostbite had claimed fingers or toes already weakened by his disease, or that respiratory infections contracted during the winter had permanently damaged his breathing. The joy of surviving another winter was often tempered by the recognition that he was weaker and less capable of facing the challenges ahead. Thomas's relationship with his family would have been one of the most painful aspects of his condition. Medieval law and custom severely restricted contact between lepers and their healthy relatives, but complete separation was often impossible or impractical. Margaret, his wife, would have faced tremendous social pressure to abandon her afflicted husband completely. But she might have risked reputation and safety to provide him with food and news of their children. These clandestine meetings would have been emotionally devastating for both parties. Margaret would have approached Thomas's hut under cover of darkness, leaving food at a predetermined location, and perhaps waiting at a safe distance for brief conversations that had to be conducted across yards of empty space. She could never again touch her husband, never comfort him physically during his suffering, never share the intimate companionship that had defined their marriage. The children's relationship with their father would have been even more complex and painful. Young Mary and baby William would have grown up knowing that their father existed but was forbidden to them, understanding that the shambling figure in grey robes who sometimes watched them from a distance was the man who had once held them, taught them, and loved them. As they grew older and developed their own understanding of leprosy's social stigma, they might have experienced shame about their father's condition, complicated by love and loss that they could never fully resolve. Medieval society offered no counseling or support for families dealing with leprosy's social consequences. The trauma experienced by the spouse and children of a diagnosed leper was considered unfortunate but inevitable, another aspect of God's mysterious plan that had to be accepted without complaint. Margaret might have been encouraged to remarry, as her husband was legally dead and she was free to form new relationships. But the stigma associated with having been married to a leper could make finding a new husband difficult. The broader community's relationship with Thomas would have evolved over the years of his exile. Initially, his former friends and neighbors might have felt genuine sympathy for his plight, combined with relief that they had been spared his fate. Over time, however, familiarity might have bred indifference or even resentment. The healthy villagers might have grown tired of providing charity to someone they saw as a burden on their community, especially during years when harvests were poor and resources were scarce. Some community members might have developed genuine compassion for Thomas, recognizing his continued humanity despite his afflicted state. These individuals might have provided more generous charity or found ways to communicate with him that offered emotional support along with material assistance. However, they would have had to be careful about showing too much concern for a leper, as excessive sympathy might have raised suspicions about their own spiritual or physical health. The village children would have been taught to fear and avoid Thomas, their natural curiosity about the mysterious figure living on the outskirts of their community, discouraged through stories about the dangers of leprosy and the importance of maintaining proper distance from the afflicted. Some children might have developed a cruel sport of throwing stones at Thomas or taunting him from what they considered a safe distance, their behavior reflecting adult attitudes even as it caused additional suffering to someone already bearing tremendous burdens. Thomas's former trade as a carpenter would have become a source of particular pain as he watched others take over the work he had once performed with skill and pride. His tools, his workshop, his reputation as a craftsman, all these things that had defined his identity and provided his livelihood were lost forever when he received his diagnosis. He might have seen inferior work being performed by his replacements, knowing that he could have done better but being powerless to intervene or even offer advice. The economic impact of leprosy extended beyond the afflicted individual to affect entire families and communities. Margaret would have lost not only her husband's companionship, but also his income, forcing her to depend on charity or find other ways to support herself and her children. In a society where women had limited economic opportunities, this could lead to poverty that affected generations. The children might have been unable to afford apprenticeships or marriages that would have been possible if their father had remained healthy and productive. The religious implications of leprosy created additional psychological suffering for those diagnosed with the condition. Medieval Christianity taught that disease was often a consequence of sin, leading many lepers to search their memories for transgressions that might have earned them divine punishment. Thomas might have spent countless hours examining his past behavior, trying to identify the moral failing that had brought this terrible fate upon himself and his family. This theological framework created a cruel paradox for lepers. They were simultaneously told that their suffering was punishment for sin, implying moral responsibility for their condition, and that they were blessed among people, their earthly suffering guaranteeing heavenly reward. The contradiction between these messages could lead to profound spiritual confusion and psychological distress, as lepers struggled to understand their relationship with a God who seemed both vengeful and merciful. The practical reality of religious life for lepers was one of exclusion and substitution. Thomas could no longer participate in the Mass that had been central to his spiritual life, but he might have been able to hear services from outside church buildings, listening to familiar prayers and hymns from beyond the boundaries that separated him from the community of believers. Special services were sometimes held for lepers, conducted outdoors where they could maintain proper distance from healthy participants. Prayer became even more important for lepers than for healthy medieval people, as it was one of the few activities that disease and social restrictions couldn't take away from them. Thomas would have spent many hours in prayer, seeking comfort for his suffering, strength to endure his trials, and hope for eventual healing or salvation. The prayers of medieval lepers often focused on themes of patience, endurance, and acceptance of God's will, reflecting their need to find meaning and purpose in circumstances that seemed meaningless and cruel. The feast days and celebrations that marked the medieval calendar would have been sources of particular pain for Thomas, as he watched from his exile while his former community celebrated together. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, and saints' days brought joy to healthy villagers, but served as reminders to lepers of their exclusion from human fellowship. The sounds of celebration, music, laughter, communal prayers, would have drifted to his hut from the village, highlighting his isolation and loss. The years of Thomas's exile would have brought gradual changes to both his condition and his circumstances. His disease might have progressed slowly, causing increasing disability, but allowing him to maintain some functional capacity for years or decades. Alternatively, he might have experienced rapid deterioration, losing the use of his hands, developing severe deformities, or suffering from secondary infections that were common complications of leprosy. The village itself would have changed during Thomas's years of exile. As new families arrived, old residents died or moved away, and the community evolved in response to broader historical trends. Thomas would have observed these changes from his unique perspective as an eternal outsider, watching the place that had once been his home transform while he remained frozen in his role as the village leper. His children would have grown to adulthood during his years of exile, their lives unfolding without his direct participation, but under the shadow of his condition. Young Mary, who had been barely old enough to understand her father's disappearance when he was first diagnosed, would have developed into a young woman whose marriage prospects were limited by the stigma of having a leper for a father. Medieval society viewed leprosy as potentially hereditary, and families with afflicted members often found it difficult to arrange advantageous marriages for their healthy children. Rest comfortably in your bed, surrounded by the unconditional love and acceptance of those who care for you. Then imagine Mary standing at her window on her wedding day. If she was fortunate enough to find someone willing to marry into a family touched by leprosy, knowing that her father watched from the distant hillside, but could never participate in this most important moment of her life. The joy of the occasion would have been forever marked by the absence of the man who should have walked her to the church, who should have given his blessing to her union, who should have danced at her wedding feast. Baby William, who had been too young to retain clear memories of his father before the diagnosis, would have grown up with only second-hand knowledge of Thomas as a healthy man. His understanding of his father would have been shaped by whispered conversations between adults, glimpses of a distant figure in grey robes, and the complex emotions that surrounded any mention of the family's afflicted member. As William learned his own trade, perhaps carpentry like his father, or perhaps something entirely different to distance himself from the stigma, he would have been haunted by questions about inherited traits and the possibility that he too might someday develop the dreaded symptoms. The grandchildren Thomas might have lived to see would have known him only as a mysterious figure of fear and pity, someone their parents spoke of in hushed tones, but whom they were strictly forbidden to approach. These children would have grown up in a world where their grandfather's existence was both acknowledged and denied, present but absent, family but not family. The psychological impact of this complicated relationship would have affected generations, creating patterns of shame, fear, and loss that extended far beyond Thomas's own suffering. Margaret's life during these years would have been a constant struggle between loyalty to her afflicted husband and the practical necessities of survival in a society that offered little support for women in her situation. She might have remarried, as the church considered her marriage to Thomas effectively ended by his civil death, but any new relationship would have been complicated by her continued connection to her first husband and the stigma associated with her family's history. If Margaret chose to remain unmarried, she would have faced the challenge of raising her children alone while maintaining whatever contact she dared with Thomas. These clandestine meetings would have become increasingly dangerous as the years passed and community tolerance for her situation diminished. Village gossips might have whispered that her continued loyalty to a leper indicated something suspicious about her own spiritual or physical health, making her position in the community increasingly precarious. As the years passed and Thomas's condition progressed, his physical appearance would have changed in ways that made him increasingly frightening to those who glimpsed him from a distance. His face might have developed the thickened features associated with advanced leprosy. His hands might have become clawed as tendons contracted, and his voice might have become so distorted that communication became difficult. These changes would have made his already limited interactions with the healthy world even more challenging. The approach of death, when it finally came for Thomas, might have brought a complex mixture of fear and relief. Death would end his suffering and isolation, but would also represent the final separation from the family and world he had watched from afar for so many years. Medieval Christian theology offered lepers particular comfort in death, teaching that their earthly suffering guaranteed heavenly reward and that they would be restored to wholeness in the afterlife. Thomas's death would likely have gone unnoticed by the broader community for days or weeks, as his isolation meant that no one was responsible for checking on his welfare regularly. His body might have been discovered by his wife during one of her clandestine visits, or by other lepers who had maintained contact with him, or simply by travelers who noticed the absence of his customary sounds and investigated his silent hut. The burial of a leper was subject to special restrictions that emphasized their continued separation from healthy society, even in death. Thomas could not be buried in the consecrated ground of the village churchyard, where his family and neighbors would eventually rest. Instead, he would have been interred in ground set aside for lepers and other outcasts, often unmarked and unmourned except by those who had shared his affliction. Margaret's grief at Thomas's death would have been complicated by the relief that his suffering had finally ended, and by the knowledge that she was now free to rebuild her life without the stigma of having a living leper husband. However, the years of separation and the traumatic circumstances of their final parting would have left emotional scars that affected her for the rest of her life. She might have felt guilt about not being able to care for him properly, regret about missed opportunities for connection, and confusion about how to remember and honor a relationship that society had forced her to deny. The children's response to their father's death would have been similarly complex, as they mourned the loss of someone who had been both present and absent throughout their lives. Thomas's death would have marked the end of a chapter of family history that had been defined by shame, fear, and loss. But it would also have removed the possibility of ever achieving resolution or reconciliation with the father they had been forced to reject. But Thomas's story, heartbreaking as it is, represents just one thread in the vast tapestry of medieval leper experience. To truly understand what it meant to be afflicted with this disease in the Middle Ages, we must explore the broader world that created and sustained such systematic cruelty toward the innocent. Let us travel now to the great city of Paris in the year 1321, where one of history's most shocking episodes of mass persecution was about to unfold. Feel the cobblestones beneath your feet as we walk through streets that would soon run red with the blood of the innocent, where fear and hatred would combine to create atrocities that shocked even medieval sensibilities. In the spring of that year, rumors began spreading throughout France that lepers were conspiring to poison wells and water sources, seeking to spread their affliction to healthy Christians as part of a vast plot orchestrated by Muslims and Jews. These accusations, completely fabricated and without any foundation in reality, would lead to one of the most systematic campaigns of genocide in medieval European history. The persecution began in the southern provinces, where local authorities, inflamed by popular hysteria, began arresting lepers en masse. Under torture, the standard method of medieval investigation, these unfortunate souls were forced to confess to crimes they had never committed, to implicate others in conspiracies that existed only in the fevered imaginations of their persecutors. Imagine, if you can, the terror experienced by a leper named Marie, who had lived peacefully for years in a small leprosarium outside Toulouse. She had adapted to her restricted life, finding meaning in the daily routines of prayer and simple labor that defined existence in the religious institution. Her days were spent spinning wool, tending the institution's small garden, and caring for lepers whose conditions were more advanced than her own. Though her life was constrained by countless restrictions, she had achieved a measure of peace and even dignity within the walls that separated her from the healthy world. On a warm morning in June 1321, that peaceful existence shattered forever. Armed men stormed through the leprosarium gates, dragging residents from their beds and workshops without explanation or mercy. Marie, awakened by screams and the crash of splintered wood, had only moments to understand that her world was ending before rough hands seized her arms and bound them behind her back with coarse rope. The accusations hurled at her were incomprehensible: conspiracy, poisoning, treason against Christianity itself. How could she, who could barely walk the length of the leprosarium's chapel without pain, who depended on charity for her daily bread, who had no contact with the healthy world beyond the institution's walls, be guilty of such elaborate crimes? The torture chamber where Marie found herself was a place designed to break both body and spirit through systematic application of pain. The techniques used were refined through centuries of practice, calibrated to cause maximum suffering while keeping victims alive long enough to provide the confessions their torturers sought. The rack stretched her limbs until joints dislocated with audible pops. Red-hot irons seared her flesh, filling the chamber with the stench of burning skin and hair. Water was forced down her throat until she felt she would burst, then suddenly stopped, leaving her gasping and choking as she drowned in her own body. Through it all, her interrogators demanded admission of guilt for crimes she could not even understand. They wanted her to confess that she had poisoned wells, though she had never been permitted near a public water source. They insisted she admit to receiving gold from Jewish conspirators, though she owned nothing but the simple grey robe that marked her status as a leper. They required her to name accomplices in plots she had never heard of, to implicate friends and fellow lepers in conspiracies that existed only in the minds of their persecutors. Eventually, as her body failed and her mind reeled from pain and exhaustion, Marie gave them the words they wanted to hear. She confessed to poisoning wells she had never seen, to receiving payments she had never touched, to participating in meetings that had never occurred. Her confession, written in the shaking hand of a scribe who recorded her words between screams, would become evidence used to justify the murder of hundreds of other innocent people. The execution of convicted lepers was designed to be both punishment and public spectacle, intended to satisfy popular demand for vengeance, while serving as a warning to any who might consider similar crimes. Marie was dragged to a specially constructed platform in Toulouse's main square, where a crowd of thousands had gathered to witness justice being served. The pyre built for her burning was enormous, constructed from logs and bundled sticks that would ensure the flames burned hot and long. Rest in your bed, protected by laws and institutions that recognize your fundamental human dignity. Then try to imagine Marie's final moments as she was chained to the stake that would be her death. The crowd surrounding her was composed of people she might have known in her previous life as a healthy person. Neighbors, merchants, craftsmen who had once treated her with ordinary human courtesy before disease marked her as untouchable. Now they screamed for her blood, their faces twisted with hatred and righteous fury as they called for God's justice to be served. The flames, when they came, brought an end to suffering that had lasted far too long. Marie's death was neither quick nor merciful, but it was final. Her body, reduced to ash and bone fragments, was scattered to prevent any possibility of Christian burial, denying her even the comfort of religious ritual that might have provided meaning to her torment. Marie's death was only one of hundreds that summer, as the persecution of lepers spread throughout France like wildfire consuming dry grassland. In village after village, lepers were dragged from their hiding places and subjected to trials that were predetermined to end in execution. The few leprosaria that existed were emptied, their residents murdered on charges of conspiracy and treason. By autumn, the leper population of France had been virtually eliminated, reduced from thousands to a scattered handful who had managed to flee to other kingdoms or hide so successfully that they escaped detection. King Philip V initially supported the persecution, issuing royal decrees that authorized local authorities to investigate and punish lepers involved in the supposed conspiracy. The monarchy's involvement lent official sanction to what might otherwise have remained local violence, encouraging even more systematic and thorough elimination of lepers throughout the kingdom. Only gradually, as the economic and social costs of the persecution became apparent, did royal enthusiasm for the campaign begin to wane. The economic impact of murdering an entire population was more significant than medieval authorities had anticipated. Lepers, despite their social exclusion, had performed valuable economic functions within medieval society. They had operated mills, workshops, and farms that were affiliated with leprosaria. They had served as a source of cheap labor for tasks that healthy people preferred to avoid. Their elimination left gaps in local economies that took years to fill, contributing to food shortages and economic disruption in regions where the persecution had been most thorough. The broader social consequences were equally serious. The murder of lepers had demonstrated that entire populations could be eliminated based on fabricated accusations and popular hysteria. This precedent would be remembered and applied to other vulnerable groups in subsequent decades, contributing to a pattern of persecution that would characterize late medieval European society. Jews, who had been implicated in the original leper conspiracy, faced renewed persecution and expulsion from many kingdoms. Muslims living in Christian territories found their own situations more precarious as authorities looked for new targets for popular hatred. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Those few lepers who had escaped the persecution lived in constant terror of discovery, knowing that their very existence was considered criminal by the society around them. They could not seek medical treatment, could not maintain contact with family members, could not even practice their religion openly for fear that any activity might attract attention and lead to their destruction. Yet even in this darkest chapter of medieval leper history, examples of human compassion and courage emerged. Some healthy individuals risked their own safety to hide lepers from persecutors, recognizing that the accusations were false and the persecution unjust. Certain religious authorities spoke out against the violence, arguing that lepers deserved Christian charity rather than summary execution. A few legal scholars challenged the validity of confessions extracted through torture, though their voices were largely ignored in the hysteria of the moment. The persecution of 1321 eventually ended, not because of moral awakening or legal reform, but because there were simply no more lepers left to kill. The momentum of violence that had sustained the campaign for months gradually dissipated as authorities turned their attention to other matters and popular enthusiasm for mass murder waned. The silence that followed was not peace, but the emptiness that remains when systematic genocide has achieved its goals. But let us not end our journey in the darkness of persecution and death. Instead, let us travel to a different time and place, where we can witness not only the suffering of medieval lepers, but also the remarkable resilience and humanity they maintained, despite their circumstances. Take a deep breath and allow your mind to drift to the countryside of southern France in the year 1274, 27 years before the Great Persecution, when the world still held space for stories of unexpected compassion and quiet heroism. Here, in the rolling hills of Provence, stood the leprosarium of Saint-Maurice, one of the largest and most well-established leper hospitals in medieval Europe. Unlike the crude huts where isolated lepers like Thomas lived and died, Saint-Maurice was a proper institution, with stone buildings, organized routines, and a community of afflicted individuals who had found ways to create meaning and dignity within the constraints of their condition. Feel the warmth of Mediterranean sunshine on your skin as we approach the leprosarium's gates, massive wooden doors set into walls that were designed not only to keep lepers in, but to keep the healthy world out. The walls themselves tell a story of gradual construction over many decades, with newer stone additions visible alongside the original timber palisades that had first enclosed this refuge for the unwanted. Gardens bloom along the interior walls, tended by residents whose patient care has coaxed beauty from the poor soil allocated to their use. Inside these walls lived Brother Antoine, once a renowned illuminator of manuscripts who had worked in the great monastery of Cluny, before the appearance of white patches on his hands had ended his career and separated him forever from the religious community that had been his life. Now, 15 years after his diagnosis, he had become the unofficial leader of Saint Maurice's residents, his natural intelligence and education making him the person to whom others turned for guidance and support. Settle deeper into your comfortable bed, then imagine Antoine as he begins his daily routine in the cold, pre-dawn darkness of his small cell. The stone walls around him are bare except for a simple wooden cross and a small shelf that holds his most precious possessions. A partially completed illuminated psalter that he continues to work on despite the progressive loss of feeling in his fingers, and a collection of letters from his sister Marguerite, who risks social censure by maintaining correspondence with her afflicted brother. Antoine's day begins, like that of all residents of Saint Maurice, with the ringing of bells that call the community to prayer. Matin, the first religious service of the day, takes place in the leprosarium's chapel, a building constructed specifically for the use of lepers and therefore considered unsuitable for healthy Christians. The chapel is smaller and simpler than those used by normal congregations, but it has been decorated with loving care by residents who have contributed their skills to create beauty within their place of exile. The congregation that gathers for morning prayers is a cross-section of medieval society, rendered equal by their shared affliction. Former merchants kneel beside former peasants, dispossessed nobles pray alongside reformed prostitutes, and learned clerks share hymn books with illiterate laborers. Disease has stripped away the social distinctions that governed their previous lives, creating a community based on mutual need and understanding rather than birth or wealth. Antoine's voice, roughened by the disease that has affected his throat and airways, still carries the trained intonations of his monastic education as he leads the community in prayers that have special meaning for those whose bodies are slowly failing. The Psalms take on particular poignancy when recited by people who truly understand suffering. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord," resonates with immediate, personal truth rather than abstract theological concept. After morning prayers, the residents of Saint Maurice begin the work that sustains their community and provides what little income the institution can generate. Antoine makes his way to the scriptorium, a small but well-equipped room where he and several other educated lepers continue the work of copying and illuminating manuscripts despite their physical limitations. The irony of lepers, considered spiritually corrupted by medieval society, spending their days copying and decorating religious texts, is not lost on Antoine, but he finds profound meaning in the work nonetheless. Appreciate the ease with which you can move your fingers to turn pages, adjust your blankets, or reach for a glass of water. Then consider the extraordinary patience required for Antoine to complete even a single letter of his illuminated texts. The progressive nerve damage caused by his leprosy had robbed him of fine motor control, making the delicate work of manuscript illumination a constant struggle against his own failing body. Each carefully drawn line required concentration and effort that would have been unconscious in his healthy years, and mistakes were increasingly common as his condition advanced. Yet Antoine persevered, developing techniques and adaptations that allowed him to continue his art despite his physical limitations. He had learned to work in shorter sessions, resting his hands frequently to prevent cramping and tremors. He had modified his tools, building up the handles of his brushes and pens to accommodate his reduced grip strength. Most importantly, he had learned to find satisfaction in works that were less technically perfect than his earlier masterpieces, but which carried emotional depth and spiritual meaning that his healthy work had sometimes lacked. The other residents of Saint Maurice had similarly adapted their former skills to their current circumstances, creating a community that was both economically productive and spiritually sustaining. Brother Guillaume, once a master carpenter before his diagnosis, had established a workshop where simpler wooden items could be produced and sold to support the institution. Sister Matilda, a former baker, supervised the production of bread and simple foods that could be preserved and sold at markets in nearby towns. The leprosarium also housed several women, though medieval attitudes toward gender meant that their experiences differed significantly from those of male residents. Sister Beatrice, who had been the wife of a prosperous cloth merchant before her diagnosis, struggled with the loss of her maternal role more than with any of the physical hardships imposed by her condition. She had been forced to abandon 3 young children when her leprosy was discovered, and the pain of separation from them dominated her emotional life within the institution. Beatrice had channeled her maternal instincts into caring for other residents whose conditions were more advanced than her own, becoming an informal nurse who provided practical assistance and emotional support to those who could no longer care for themselves independently. Her gentle ministrations to the dying and her patient help with daily tasks for the disabled made her an essential figure in the leprosarium's community life, though her contributions were rarely acknowledged formally by the male authorities who controlled the institution. The children who occasionally appeared at St. Maurice presented particularly heartbreaking situations that tested the community's capacity for compassion and care. Medieval medicine did not understand that leprosy is rarely transmitted from parent to child, so infants born to leprous mothers were assumed to be infected and were separated from healthy society along with their parents. These children, who might never develop the disease themselves, grew up within the leprosarium's walls without ever experiencing normal social contact or family life. Little Marie, the daughter of a former prostitute who had developed leprosy while still young, had lived her entire 7 years within St. Maurice and knew no other world than the community of the afflicted. Her presence brought both joy and sorrow to residents who saw in her innocent play and laughter a reminder of the childhood experiences they had lost or been forced to abandon. The community rallied to provide her with education, affection, and protection, creating a collective family structure that compensated partially for her isolation from normal society. Antoine took particular interest in little Marie's education, teaching her to read and write with the same careful attention he had once devoted to training novice monks in the art of manuscript illumination. Her quick intelligence and eagerness to learn reminded him of his own early enthusiasm for scholarship, and he found in her education a way to pass on some of the knowledge and skills that would otherwise die with him. The child's questions about the world beyond the leprosarium's walls were both touching and painful for residents who struggled to explain why she could not visit the villages and towns that she could see from the institution's towers. How do you tell a 7-year-old that she is considered too dangerous and contaminated for normal human contact? How do you maintain hope and curiosity in a child whose opportunities for experience and growth are so severely limited? Yet little Marie's presence also brought unexpected gifts to the leprosarium community. Her laughter echoed through corridors that were normally filled with the sounds of suffering and resignation. Her games and imaginative play reminded adults of possibilities beyond their immediate circumstances. Her innocent affection for residents whom the outside world considered monstrous and untouchable provided evidence of their continued capacity to love and be loved. The seasonal celebrations at St. Maurice took on special meaning because of Marie's presence, as adults worked to create holiday magic for someone who had never experienced the broader cultural traditions that gave meaning to religious festivals. Christmas became an occasion for elaborate storytelling and simple gift-giving, as residents pooled their limited resources to provide the child with tokens of affection and celebration. The educational opportunities available within St. Maurice extended beyond Little Marie to include adult residents who had never had access to formal learning in their previous lives. Antoine and other educated residents had established informal schools that operated during evening hours, teaching basic literacy and numeracy to those who desired such skills. These educational activities served multiple purposes. They provided intellectual stimulation for teachers, practical knowledge for students, and evidence to outside authorities that the leprosarium was contributing to the moral and spiritual improvement of its residents. The Library of Saint-Maurice, though small by the standards of great monasteries or universities, represented a precious repository of knowledge and culture within the world of the afflicted. The collection had been assembled gradually through donations from church officials, gifts from noble patrons, and books brought by residents when they entered the institution. Antoine served as the unofficial librarian, cataloguing volumes and ensuring their preservation for future generations of residents. The leprosarium's scriptorium, where Antoine and other educated residents continued their work of copying and illuminating manuscripts, served as both economic enterprise and cultural preservation project. The books they produced provided income for the institution, while also ensuring that important texts would survive for future generations. Their work was particularly valuable because healthy scribes were sometimes reluctant to copy texts that dealt with disease, death, or other subjects considered spiritually dangerous. The manuscripts produced at Saint-Maurice bore subtle marks of their origin in the world of the afflicted. The illuminations often included imagery related to suffering, healing, and divine mercy that reflected the personal experiences of their creators. The calligraphy, while technically proficient, sometimes showed the slight irregularities that resulted from the progressive nerve damage that affected many residents. These characteristics made the books distinctive and, to some collectors, particularly valuable as examples of art created under extraordinary circumstances. As another winter approaches Saint-Maurice, the residents prepare once again for the seasonal challenges that test their resilience and determination. The manuscripts in progress must be carefully stored to protect them from cold and humidity that could damage months of painstaking work. The scriptorium's tools must be cleaned and preserved to ensure they remain functional when work resumes in the spring. The community's routines must be adjusted to accommodate the shorter days and reduced opportunities for productive activity. Yet winter also brings its own possibilities for growth and reflection. The enforced leisure of the coldest months provides opportunities for education, spiritual development, and community building that are sometimes overlooked during busier seasons. Antoine plans to use the winter evenings to work on a special project, an illuminated prayer book designed specifically for use by lepers, incorporating imagery and text that speaks directly to their unique experiences and spiritual needs. This personal project represents more than mere artistic expression. It is Antoine's attempt to create something that will survive beyond his own limited lifespan and provide comfort to future generations of afflicted individuals. The prayer book will include meditations on suffering, illustrations of saints who overcame physical hardships, and liturgical materials adapted for communities that cannot participate in normal religious services. The project has become a collaborative effort involving many residents of Saint-Maurice, each contributing according to their abilities and interests. Sister Beatrice has provided suggestions for prayers that address the particular emotional challenges faced by women who have been separated from their children. Little Marie has inspired decorative elements that incorporate images of hope and renewal appropriate for young people facing uncertain futures. As the manuscript takes shape through the long winter months, it becomes more than a book. It transforms into a testament to the resilience, creativity, and humanity of people whom society has written off as spiritually dead. Each page represents hours of careful work by individuals whose hands shake with disease, but whose spirits remain unbroken. Each illustration tells a story of hope maintained in the face of seemingly insurmountable hardship. The completion of the prayer book will coincide with Antoine's recognition that his own abilities are declining beyond the point where he can continue productive work. The manuscript will serve as both his masterpiece and his farewell to the art that has provided meaning and purpose during his years of exile. Yet rather than representing an ending, the book will mark a new beginning as other residents continue the traditions he has established and adapt them to their own circumstances and capabilities. But our journey through the medieval world of leprosy would not be complete without understanding how the disease affected different levels of society and how the experiences of lepers varied according to their circumstances before diagnosis. Let us travel now to England in the year 1315, where we encounter Lady Eleanor de Montfort, once a powerful noblewoman who controlled vast estates and wielded considerable political influence until the appearance of suspicious lesions on her face forced her into a very different kind of existence. Lady Eleanor's story illustrates how even wealth and noble birth provided only temporary protection against the social death that awaited all lepers in medieval society. Her initial attempts to conceal her condition through cosmetics and careful clothing choices delayed her diagnosis by several months, but the progressive nature of her symptoms eventually made concealment impossible. When the royal physician confirmed what she had long feared, Eleanor faced the same ritual of separation that had destroyed Thomas the carpenter and countless others. The ceremony of Eleanor's social death took place not in a village church, but in the great cathedral of Winchester, attended by bishops and nobles who had once sought her favor at court. The irony was not lost on those present that this woman, who had once commanded armies and negotiated treaties, was now being symbolically buried while still breathing. The earth cast upon her head in the cathedral crypt came from soil blessed by the Archbishop himself, as if her former status required even her social death to be conducted with appropriate ceremony. Yet Eleanor's noble birth did provide her with options unavailable to common lepers. Rather than being cast out to beg on roadsides or huddle in crude huts, she was able to establish her own private leprosarium on lands that had once been part of her estate. This institution, built with her own wealth and staffed by servants who had volunteered to share her exile, represented a unique experiment in creating a more dignified form of leper existence. The private leprosarium that Eleanor created was unlike any other institution of its kind in medieval Europe. The buildings were constructed of fine stone with glass windows, a luxury almost unheard of in facilities for lepers. The residents, carefully selected from among the nobility and wealthy merchants who had been diagnosed with leprosy, lived in individual apartments rather than dormitories and were served by healthy staff who had chosen to remain with their former mistresses and masters despite the social stigma involved. Eleanor's leprosarium became a refuge for educated and cultured individuals whose exile from normal society represented not just personal tragedy, but also the loss of significant knowledge and skills. The community included former court officials who had helped govern the kingdom, scholars whose learning had contributed to the advancement of knowledge, and artists whose work had enriched the cultural life of their age. Together, they created an intellectual environment that rivaled some of the great monasteries and universities of the time. The contrast between Eleanor's experience and that of Thomas the carpenter, or the residents of St. Maurice, illustrates how medieval society's treatment of lepers, while universally harsh, still reflected the class distinctions that governed all aspects of life. The rich leper lived in comfortable exile, while the poor leper died in misery. But both were equally dead in the eyes of the law and equally excluded from the community of the healthy. Yet Eleanor's privileged position also brought unique torments that poorer lepers never experienced. Her former servants and allies now crossed themselves when her name was mentioned, and her children were forbidden from acknowledging their relationship with her. Her vast estates, which she had spent decades building up, were divided among relatives who showed no gratitude for her previous generosity. The political influence she had wielded for years evaporated overnight, leaving her helpless to prevent enemies from undoing policies she had fought to establish. The psychological adjustment required for someone who had lived at the pinnacle of medieval society to accept complete powerlessness and social death was perhaps more severe than what faced lepers from humbler backgrounds. Eleanor had farther to fall, and the contrast between her former life and current circumstances was more stark. She struggled with depression and rage that manifested in violent outbursts directed at staff and fellow residents who were trying to help her adjust to her new reality. The establishment of private leprosaria like Eleanor's represented an important development in medieval approaches to leprosy care. These institutions demonstrated that alternative models of leper existence were possible within the constraints of medieval understanding and social structure. They provided examples of how wealth and education could be used to create more humane conditions for the afflicted, though they also highlighted the arbitrary nature of a system that provided comfort to some lepers while condemning others to misery based solely on their economic circumstances. Eleanor's leprosarium survived for several decades, continuing to operate even after her death under the management of residents who had learned administrative skills from their former mistress. The institution eventually became a model for other privately funded leper hospitals, contributing to a gradual improvement in the treatment of affluent lepers while doing little to address the suffering of their poorer counterparts. The legacy of Eleanor's experiment in creating a more dignified form of leper existence extended beyond her immediate community. Her detailed records of life within the leprosarium, maintained by educated residents who understood the historical importance of their unique situation, provide modern historians with invaluable insights into medieval attitudes toward disease, disability, and social exclusion. These documents reveal the complex emotions and relationships that developed within leper communities, contradicting medieval assumptions about the spiritual and intellectual degradation of the afflicted. As we prepare to conclude our journey through the medieval world of leprosy, we carry with us a deeper understanding of both the cruelty and compassion that characterized this dark chapter of human history. The stories we have followed, Thomas the carpenter struggling alone in his crude hut, Marie burned alive in Toulouse's public square, Antoine creating beauty amid suffering at Saint-Maurice, Eleanor attempting to maintain dignity in comfortable exile, remind us that behind every historical statistic were real people with hopes and fears, relationships and dreams, who suffered and died because society chose to treat them as less than human. Their experiences reveal the arbitrary nature of medieval justice, where fear and ignorance combined with religious prejudice to create systems that destroyed innocent lives while claiming moral justification. The medical understanding of leprosy as we know it today, a mildly contagious bacterial infection easily treated with modern antibiotics, makes the medieval response seem both tragic and absurd. Yet the mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to participate in or support systematic cruelty toward vulnerable populations remain disturbingly familiar. The persecution of medieval lepers offers lessons that extend far beyond their specific historical context. The techniques developed for identifying, isolating, and eliminating unwanted populations have been refined and applied repeatedly throughout human history. The psychological mechanisms that allowed good people to participate in evil actions continue to operate in contemporary societies. The religious and ideological justifications used to legitimize systematic cruelty adapt themselves to new circumstances while serving the same fundamental purpose. Perhaps most importantly, the stories of medieval lepers remind us that human dignity and worth are not dependent on social acceptance or physical capability. The creativity, compassion, and courage displayed by people like Antoine, Eleanor, and countless others whose names have been lost to history demonstrate that the human spirit can transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. Their achievements stand as testimony to the persistence of hope and meaning in the face of overwhelming adversity. The gradual disappearance of leprosy from medieval Europe came not through medical breakthrough or social reform, but through the systematic elimination of those who suffered from the disease. The silence that followed was not healing, but the emptiness that remains when entire populations have been erased from history. Yet their legacy persists in the institutions they created, the knowledge they preserved, the art they produced, and the example they provided of human resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. As you drift toward sleep in your comfortable bed, surrounded by the warmth and security that medieval lepers could only dream of, perhaps you can carry with you some appreciation for the extraordinary courage of those who endured such circumstances. Their experiences challenge us to examine our own attitudes toward difference and disability, to question the ways our society treats those who are vulnerable or marginalized, and to recognize our own capacity for both persecution and protection of those who cannot defend themselves. The distance between their world and ours is measured not only in centuries, but in our accumulated understanding of disease, our development of more humane social policies, and our growing recognition that all people deserve dignity and compassion regardless of their physical condition. Yet the fundamental questions raised by their experiences remain relevant. How do we respond to fear of the unknown? How do we treat those who are different from ourselves? What responsibilities do we bear for protecting the vulnerable members of our communities? Sleep now, dear listener, knowing that the simple human connections you enjoy, the freedom to touch and be touched, to move through the world without shame or fear, to participate fully in your community, are precious gifts that medieval lepers like Thomas, Marie, Antoine, and Eleanor could experience only in their dreams. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of history, may your dreams be filled with gratitude for the progress humanity has made in recognizing the dignity of all people, and with determination to continue that progress in your own time and place. If you found comfort in this journey through history's shadows, please consider subscribing to join our community of gentle souls who believe the most important stories are often the hardest ones to hear. Like and share if this tale has touched your heart, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something magical about knowing our little corner of history reaches around the world to bring people together in understanding and compassion. Good night, and may your sleep be as peaceful as the rest that Thomas, Marie, Antoine, and Eleanor finally found when their long suffering came to an end, and may you wake tomorrow with a deeper appreciation for the simple human dignities that make life worth living.